Edgar Cayce predicted this for 2025. It's already unfolding. There are moments in human history when time itself seems to hold its breath, when the ordinary flow of events gives way to something far more profound. We are living in such a moment right now. The year 2025 isn't just another calendar page turning. It's the culmination of prophecies spoken by a man who saw through the veils of time itself. In 1944, Edgar Cayce entered what witnesses described as his deepest prophetic trance. His breathing slowed to barely perceptible rhythms. His consciousness traveled beyond the boundaries of linear time to witness events that wouldn't unfold for 8 decades. What he saw shook him so profoundly that he devoted over 200 readings to this single year, calling 2025 the year souls remember their divine purpose. The sleeping prophet described specific events with such precision that watching today's news feels like reading his personal diary written 80 years ago. Global institutions crumbling under their own corruption, millions simultaneously awakening to spiritual truths they'd never consciously learned, ancient wisdom resurging as modern solutions prove inadequate, humanity standing at a crossroads between fear-based existence and love-based consciousness. But Cayce's most startling revelation wasn't about external chaos. It was about the profound spiritual awakening that would emerge from this year's trials. He saw 2025 as the pivot point when humanity would finally remember what it had forgotten, that we are divine souls temporarily experiencing physical existence, not physical beings occasionally having spiritual experiences. The prophecies he spoke in that 1944 trance are unfolding exactly as he foresaw. Every crisis you're witnessing, every awakening you're experiencing, every impossible synchronicity appearing in your life, all of it was mapped in his readings as necessary preparation for humanity's greatest graduation. What makes this moment even more extraordinary is that you chose to be here for it. Your soul didn't accidentally incarnate during this pivotal time. You came specifically to participate in the transformation Cayce saw coming. Edgar Cayce's prophetic accuracy remains unmatched in recorded spiritual history. He predicted both world wars when peace seemed permanent. He foresaw the stock market crash of 1929, while economists proclaimed eternal prosperity. He described technological breakthroughs that wouldn't manifest for decades, speaking of global communication networks, artificial intelligence, and healing devices that seemed like pure fantasy to his contemporaries. But his gift extended far beyond simple prediction. Cayce accessed what he called the river of time, a dimension where past, present, and future exist simultaneously. From this timeless perspective, he could perceive the intricate patterns connecting human choices across centuries, watching how individual decisions rippled through generations to create the world we inhabit today. Of all his prophetic work, none received more attention or urgent detail than his visions of 2025. Across 3 decades of readings, he returned to this year obsessively, as if drawn by cosmic forces he couldn't ignore. He called it the pivot point of human consciousness, the year of the great choosing, and most memorably, the time when Earth's children remember they are heaven's citizens. In one remarkable 1943 reading, preserved in the ARE archives, Cayce described the spiritual significance of 2025 with unusual poetic intensity. The year when the veil grows thin, when souls cannot hide from their own divinity, when humanity stands naked before its choices and chooses love or perishes in its own fear. These weren't warnings of doom, but roadmaps for humanity's graduation into higher consciousness. Cayce understood that significant spiritual evolution always requires a period of apparent chaos as old systems dissolve to make space for new ones. He saw 2025 as the culmination of spiritual forces that had been building since the early 1900s, a cosmic pressure cooker designed to accelerate human awakening. The sleeping prophet emphasized repeatedly that souls incarnating in the late 20th and early 21st centuries had volunteered for this transformation. They came equipped with spiritual resilience and intuitive gifts necessary to navigate the intense energies he saw converging in 2025. Every reading about this year carried the same underlying message. What appears to be humanity's darkest hour would reveal itself as the dawn of its greatest spiritual renaissance. What cosmic forces could make a single year so pivotal that Edgar Cayce devoted decades of prophecy to its significance? The answer reveals itself in what he termed the Great Convergence, multiple spiritual, planetary, and consciousness cycles reaching completion simultaneously in 2025. First, humanity's collective karma from centuries of unconscious choices would reach a resolution point. Wars fought, oppression perpetrated, spiritual wisdom ignored, environmental damage inflicted, all of it creating what Cayce described as a karmic debt that must be balanced through conscious choice rather than unconscious suffering. The year 2025 would present humanity with opportunities to heal these ancient wounds through forgiveness, service, and spiritual understanding rather than repeating the cycles of violence and ignorance. Second, Earth itself would undergo vibrational frequency changes that would directly affect human consciousness. Cayce spoke of planetary energetic shifts that would make it increasingly difficult for souls to maintain lower vibrational states like hatred, greed, or sustained fear. The planet's energy field would literally support love-based consciousness while making fear-based thinking feel increasingly uncomfortable and unsustainable. Third, cosmic cycles involving humanity's spiritual evolution would reach a completion point. Cayce described souls who had been incarnating for thousands of years, finally approaching graduation from Earth's School of Consciousness Development. The concentrated presence of these advanced souls during 2025 would create what he called a spiritual critical mass that would accelerate awakening for all consciousness on the planet. But perhaps most significantly, Cayce revealed that 2025 would initiate what he termed the Great Sorting, a period when souls would be compelled to choose between fear-based consciousness and love-based awareness. This wouldn't be an external judgment imposed by cosmic forces, but an internal recognition emerging from within each soul as the vibrational changes made maintaining unconsciousness increasingly difficult. The mystery deepens when you realize that every major crisis unfolding now, political upheaval, environmental challenges, technological disruption, spiritual seeking, social transformation, was mapped in his readings as necessary catalysts for this consciousness evolution. The sleeping prophet saw 2025 not as humanity's end, but as its metamorphosis into something far more beautiful than previous generations could imagine. The first signs of Cayce's predicted transformation began subtly, then accelerated rapidly as we approached 2025. He foresaw what he called the Great Questioning, millions of souls simultaneously beginning to ask deeper questions about life's purpose, reality's nature, and their own spiritual identity. This awakening wouldn't be gentle or gradual. Cayce described it as souls being shaken from their spiritual slumber through external events that forced internal examination. Global crises would serve as cosmic alarm clocks, startling humanity out of unconscious routines and compelling deep self-reflection about what truly matters. In one vivid 1944 reading, he described the process: when the familiar structures crumble, when security dissolves, when certainty becomes uncertainty, then souls must choose. Will they collapse in fear or expand in faith? The year 2025 will offer this choice to every conscious being on Earth. The acceleration manifests differently for each individual, but common patterns have emerged exactly as Cayce predicted. People suddenly questioning career paths that once brought satisfaction, relationships that seemed stable revealing their spiritual emptiness, material success feeling hollow while acts of service bring unexpected fulfillment, dreams becoming more vivid and meaningful, intuitive insights arriving with startling accuracy. Perhaps most significantly, millions are experiencing spontaneous psychic abilities that they've never consciously developed, telepathic communication with loved ones, prophetic dreams that come true, healing energy flowing through their hands, knowledge arriving in their minds without conscious learning. These abilities aren't gifts reserved for special individuals. They're humanity's natural inheritance, suppressed for centuries and now returning as consciousness accelerates toward its original spiritual capacity. The sleeping prophet emphasized that this awakening would be accompanied by profound disorientation as souls realized how deeply they had been sleeping. The recognition that most of life had been spent in spiritual unconsciousness would initially create grief, then ultimately liberation as souls embraced their true, divine nature. You've likely felt these stirrings in your own consciousness, though you may not have recognized them as part of the cosmic awakening Cayce saw beginning in 2025. That restlessness, that sense of urgency, that feeling that life must hold deeper meaning, these are your soul's responses to the acceleration he predicted decades ago. One of Edgar Cayce's most precise and startling predictions involved humanity's relationship with external authority structures during 2025. He foresaw widespread rejection of institutions, governments, and hierarchies that claimed power over individual souls, not as anarchic rebellion but as spiritual maturation. The sleeping prophet understood that true spiritual evolution requires souls to recognize their own divine authority rather than surrendering power to external systems. He predicted that 2025 would mark the beginning of what he called the Great Reclamation. Humanity remembering that genuine guidance comes from within, not from institutions seeking control. In a remarkable 1942 reading, Cayce described this process with prophetic clarity. The souls will no longer bow to those who claim authority over spirit. They will recognize that each carries divine spark, that each must answer to source directly, that no earthly power can stand between soul and creator. This dissolution wouldn't happen through violent revolution, but through what he termed conscious withdrawal of consent. Millions would simply stop believing that external authorities possessed legitimate power over their spiritual choices. They would recognize that governments, religious hierarchies, and institutional systems derive their power only from collective agreement to surrender individual divine authority. The process has already begun exactly as Cayce predicted. Traditional religious denominations experiencing unprecedented membership decline as people seek direct spiritual experience rather than mediated doctrine. Political systems losing credibility as citizens recognize the spiritual bankruptcy of leaders focused solely on power rather than service. Educational institutions being questioned as people realize that wisdom cannot be transmitted through information alone, but must be developed through direct spiritual experience. Cayce emphasized that this dissolution was necessary preparation for humanity's next evolutionary phase. Souls cannot graduate into cosmic citizenship while remaining dependent on external authorities for spiritual guidance. The collapse of institutional power structures, though temporarily destabilizing, would ultimately free humanity to develop its own divine wisdom and create new forms of organization based on love and service rather than control and domination. The sleeping prophet warned that this transition would be particularly challenging for souls who had become heavily dependent on external validation and guidance. But he also promised that those willing to embrace their own divine authority would discover capabilities and wisdom they never knew they possessed. Perhaps the most intense aspect of Cayce's 2025 prophecies involved what he termed the Great Healing Crisis, a period when humanity's collective trauma, suppressed for generations, would surface simultaneously for resolution. This wouldn't be comfortable, but it would be absolutely necessary for species-wide spiritual evolution. The sleeping prophet understood that true healing cannot occur while wounds remain hidden in unconsciousness. Humanity had accumulated centuries of trauma from wars, oppression, abuse, and spiritual alienation that had been buried in collective unconsciousness rather than consciously processed and healed. 2025 would mark the year when this suppressed pain could no longer remain hidden. In one of his most emotionally intense readings, Cayce described the process. The ancient wounds will open like flowers blooming in spring, painful in their opening but beautiful in their healing. Souls will weep for sorrows they cannot consciously remember but carry in their very cells. The healing will seem to destroy before it recreates, but from this necessary dissolution, new life will emerge. The crisis manifests through multiple channels simultaneously. Racial trauma surfacing for collective healing through acknowledgement and forgiveness, rather than continued resentment and division. Generational patterns of abuse and neglect being recognized and consciously interrupted by souls refusing to perpetuate unconscious cycles. Cultural wounds from religious persecution, genocide, and oppression emerging for resolution through understanding and reconciliation. Most profoundly, humanity's disconnection from its own divine nature, the original trauma that created all other wounds, would surface for healing during this period. Souls would remember what they had forgotten, that they are spiritual beings having physical experiences, not material creatures occasionally touching something sacred. Cayce predicted that this healing crisis would create apparent chaos as ancient pain erupted into consciousness. Relationships would end as souls recognized they were repeating traumatic patterns rather than creating authentic love. Career paths would collapse as people realized they were serving systems that perpetuated unconsciousness rather than healing. Life structures built on spiritual emptiness would dissolve to make space for authentic spiritual living. But the sleeping prophet emphasized that this crisis represented healing, not destruction, like surgery, that must cut before it can cure. The dissolution of trauma-based living would ultimately free humanity to create civilization based on love, wisdom, and service, rather than fear, ignorance, and exploitation. The intensity you may be feeling in your own life, relationships changing, career uncertainty, deep emotional processing, these are signs that your soul is participating in the collective healing Cayce saw as essential preparation for humanity's spiritual renaissance. Of all Edgar Cayce's mystical predictions, perhaps none seemed more impossible to his contemporaries than his vision of Earth itself undergoing vibrational frequency changes that would directly affect human consciousness. Yet modern science has begun confirming what the sleeping prophet saw decades ago. Our planet's electromagnetic field is indeed shifting in ways that influence brain states and consciousness. Cayce described these changes with remarkable precision for someone speaking in 1944. The Earth's song will change its rhythm, and human hearts must learn to dance to higher frequencies or find themselves increasingly out of harmony with life itself. He saw the planet's energy field shifting to frequencies that would naturally support love-based consciousness, while making fear-based thinking feel increasingly uncomfortable and unsustainable. This shift would create what he called a natural spiritual selection process, not imposed by external judgment, but emerging from the vibrational incompatibility between high-frequency planetary energy and low-frequency human consciousness. Souls aligned with love, service, and spiritual growth would find themselves energized and empowered by Earth's new vibrations. Those clinging to fear, hatred, and materialistic consciousness would experience increasing discomfort until they chose to raise their vibration or withdrew from earthly incarnation. In one particularly vivid reading, Cayce described how this would feel to individuals. Like fish trying to breathe air, souls maintaining lower vibrations will find existence increasingly difficult, not as punishment, but as natural consequence. The earth will no longer sustain consciousness based in fear, just as darkness cannot exist where light has entered. The vibrational shift would manifest through multiple phenomena: increased sensitivity to others' emotions as telepathic abilities naturally emerge, dreams becoming more vivid and prophetic as sleep states align with higher dimensions, physical symptoms in those resisting the changes as their bodies attempt to adjust to new energy frequencies, accelerated manifestation of thoughts and intentions as the gap between mental creation and physical experience narrows. Most significantly, Cayce predicted that maintaining negative emotions for extended periods would become physically and mentally exhausting. Hatred, resentment, and fear would require enormous energy to sustain, while love, forgiveness, and service would feel increasingly natural and effortless. The sleeping prophet emphasized that this shift was not something happening to humanity, but something humanity was co-creating through its collective spiritual evolution. As more souls chose love over fear, their raised consciousness contributed to the planetary vibrational increase, creating a positive feedback loop that would accelerate the transformation. If you've been feeling more emotionally sensitive, experiencing unusual synchronicities, or finding that negative thoughts create immediate discomfort, while positive ones bring energy and clarity, you're likely experiencing the vibrational shifts Cayce predicted would intensify throughout 2025. Long before computers existed, Edgar Cayce predicted that by 2025, humanity would develop technologies that would either accelerate spiritual evolution or create deeper spiritual enslavement. His prophecies about artificial intelligence, global communication networks, and consciousness-altering devices seemed like pure fantasy to audiences in the 1940s, yet every prediction has manifested with startling accuracy. The sleeping prophet saw technology as spiritually neutral, neither inherently good nor evil, but responsive to the consciousness wielding it. In one prophetic reading, he declared, "The same force that can heal can kill. The same knowledge that can liberate can enslave. The machines will serve the consciousness that creates them, and humanity's spiritual development will determine whether these tools become instruments of awakening or deeper sleep." Cayce specifically predicted the emergence of artificial intelligence by 2025, describing it as minds made of metal that could think faster than flesh but cannot feel. He warned that humanity would face a crucial choice about how to integrate these technologies with spiritual wisdom. Used consciously, AI could free humans from repetitive mental tasks, allowing more time for meditation, service, and spiritual development. Used unconsciously, it could create dependency and spiritual laziness, with humans surrendering their divine gift of consciousness to mechanical intelligence. The sleeping prophet was particularly concerned about what he called the Great Distraction, technologies designed to capture human attention and keep souls focused on external stimulation rather than internal spiritual development. He foresaw devices that would provide endless entertainment and information while starving the soul of the silence and reflection necessary for spiritual growth. But Cayce also saw tremendous potential in 2025's technological developments. He predicted healing devices that would work with human energy fields to restore balance and health, communication technologies that would connect like-minded souls across the planet, creating global spiritual communities, educational systems that would adapt to individual learning styles and help souls discover their unique gifts and purposes. Most remarkably, he foresaw technologies that would enhance rather than replace human psychic abilities, devices that would amplify telepathic communication, machines that could detect and display human auras, systems that would help people access their own Akashic Records and past life memories. The key factor determining whether these technologies serve spiritual evolution or prevent it would be humanity's consciousness level when they fully manifest. Souls who maintained strong spiritual practices and inner authority would use technology as tools for service and growth. Those who had surrendered their spiritual development to external authorities would become enslaved by the very innovations meant to liberate them. Your relationship with technology right now, whether you use it consciously for growth and connection or unconsciously for escape and distraction, may determine your ability to navigate the technological choices Cayce saw as pivotal to humanity's spiritual future. Edgar Cayce predicted that 2025 would mark the beginning of humanity's return to intuitive wisdom as the primary guidance system, with logical reasoning becoming the servant rather than master of consciousness. This represented a profound reversal of the intellectual dominance that had characterized Western civilization for centuries. The sleeping prophet saw this renaissance emerging naturally from the vibrational shifts and consciousness acceleration he predicted for this period. As human brains adjusted to higher frequencies, dormant psychic abilities would spontaneously activate. Telepathic communication would become commonplace. Prophetic dreams would provide guidance for daily decisions. Healing energy would flow naturally through hands and hearts, opened by spiritual development. In one beautiful 1943 reading, Cayce described this transformation. The children of earth will remember they are citizens of heaven. The knowing that comes from source will flow through prepared vessels like water through cleaned channels. Mind will serve spirit instead of spirit serving mind. This renaissance wouldn't reject intellectual capacity but integrate it with spiritual wisdom, creating a new model of human consciousness that balanced analytical thinking with intuitive knowing, scientific observation with mystical insight, material understanding with spiritual truth. Cayce predicted that a generation would emerge who naturally accessed information through spiritual attunement rather than only through physical senses and intellectual study. These individuals would make decisions based on inner guidance that proved consistently more accurate than purely logical analysis. They would communicate through empathic connection as naturally as through spoken language. They would heal through energy transmission as readily as through medical intervention. The sleeping prophet emphasized that this renaissance would be accompanied by new educational approaches that honored intuitive development alongside intellectual training. Children would learn to trust their inner knowing while developing their reasoning abilities. Adults would rediscover psychic gifts they had possessed as children but been taught to suppress through social conditioning. Most significantly, the distinction between spiritual and practical wisdom would dissolve. Business decisions would be made through prayerful consideration of their impact on all souls involved. Relationships would be guided by spiritual compatibility rather than superficial attraction. Life choices would emerge from deep attunement to soul purpose rather than social expectations or material security concerns. The intuitive renaissance would also transform humanity's relationship with creativity and innovation. Cayce predicted that breakthrough discoveries and artistic expressions would come through direct spiritual inspiration rather than gradual intellectual development. Scientists would receive complete theories in meditation. Artists would channel works that expressed universal truths. Inventors would be guided to develop technologies that served spiritual evolution. If you've been experiencing increased intuitive insights, prophetic dreams, or sudden knowing about situations you haven't intellectually analyzed, you're participating in the Renaissance Cayce saw beginning in 2025. While Edgar Cayce's ultimate vision for 2025 was profoundly hopeful, he issued specific warnings about the dangers souls would face during this intensive transformation period. The same energies that could accelerate spiritual evolution could also create serious difficulties for those unprepared to navigate heightened spiritual frequencies. The sleeping prophet warned that souls who had neglected spiritual development might experience what he called vibrational shock as Earth's energy field shifted to higher frequencies. This could manifest as mental confusion, emotional instability, physical illness, or psychological breakdown in individuals whose consciousness couldn't adjust to the new planetary vibrations. In one sobering reading, Cayce described the symptoms. Those who have lived only in lower vibrations will find themselves like deep-sea creatures brought suddenly to the surface. The pressure change may prove too much for systems unprepared for transformation. He also cautioned about false spiritual teachers who would emerge during this period to mislead souls experiencing awakening. As millions began seeking spiritual truth, individuals motivated by personal power rather than service would present themselves as enlightened guides. Cayce emphasized the importance of discernment, warning that genuine spiritual teachers could be recognized by their humility, service orientation, and insistence that students develop their own divine connection, rather than dependency on external authorities. Perhaps most concerning, the sleeping prophet predicted increased activity from what he termed lower astral entities, consciousness forms motivated by fear and control that would attempt to influence awakening souls towards spiritual confusion and regression. As the veil between dimensions thinned during 2025, souls would need strong spiritual protection through prayer, meditation, and service to others. Cayce was particularly concerned about souls who might become spiritually prideful during their awakening, believing that psychic abilities or mystical experiences made them superior to others. He warned that spiritual pride was one of the greatest obstacles to genuine evolution, creating karma that could delay soul development for lifetimes. The sleeping prophet also predicted that some souls would become overwhelmed by the intensity of collective healing and transformation, choosing to leave physical incarnation rather than participate in the challenging but ultimately beautiful process of consciousness evolution. He emphasized that this wasn't failure but simply different timing. These souls would return when conditions were more suitable for their particular development needs. The warnings weren't meant to create fear but to emphasize the importance of spiritual preparation. Souls who maintained regular spiritual practices, served others with genuine love, and sought divine protection through prayer would navigate 2025's challenges successfully and emerge transformed. Your commitment to spiritual growth, your willingness to serve others, and your dedication to choosing love over fear in difficult situations are your best protection during this pivotal time. Edgar Cayce predicted that 2025 would witness a revolutionary transformation in humanity's approach to health and healing, with consciousness recognized as the foundation of physical well-being. This shift would represent a return to ancient wisdom combined with modern understanding, creating healing modalities that addressed spiritual, mental, and physical health as integrated aspects of whole-being wellness. The sleeping prophet foresaw medical establishments beginning to acknowledge what he had taught for decades, that illness originates in spiritual and emotional imbalance, and lasting healing requires addressing consciousness as well as physical symptoms. He predicted that by 2025, mainstream healthcare would begin integrating meditation, energy healing, and spiritual counseling with traditional medical treatments. In one prescient reading, Cayce described this transformation. The healers will remember that they treat souls temporarily wearing bodies, not bodies occasionally housing souls. The medicine of the future will heal the whole being, addressing cause in consciousness rather than only effect in flesh. This revolution would manifest through multiple channels simultaneously: alternative healing modalities, acupuncture, homeopathy, energy medicine, spiritual counseling, would gain widespread acceptance and integration. With conventional medical practice, individuals would take greater personal responsibility for their health through spiritual practices, conscious nutrition, and emotional healing work. Most significantly, Cayce predicted that healing would become increasingly recognized as a spiritual gift available to ordinary people rather than only trained medical professionals. As consciousness accelerated and psychic abilities emerged, millions would discover natural healing capabilities through touch, prayer, and energy transmission. The distinction between patient and healer would blur as people recognized their mutual participation in the healing process. The sleeping prophet was particularly excited about what he called consciousness medicine, healing approaches that worked directly with patients' belief systems, emotional patterns, and spiritual understanding to create physical transformation. He predicted that conditions considered incurable by conventional medicine would respond dramatically to treatments that addressed their spiritual and emotional origins. Cayce also foresaw a revolution in preventive health through spiritual alignment. As people developed stronger connections to their inner guidance, they would naturally make lifestyle choices that supported their highest well-being. Dietary decisions would be guided by intuitive understanding of what their bodies needed. Exercise would become a form of moving meditation. Sleep would be recognized as sacred time for spiritual renewal and healing. The wellness revolution would extend beyond individual health to community and planetary healing. Environmental medicine would emerge as healers recognized the connection between Earth's well-being and human health. Healing circles and spiritual communities would provide support for emotional and spiritual recovery from generations of trauma and disconnection. If you've been drawn to alternative healing modalities, experienced spontaneous healing through spiritual practices, or felt called to develop your own healing abilities, you're participating in the revolution Cayce saw transforming healthcare throughout 2025 and beyond. Edgar Cayce revealed that 2025 would represent a massive karmic clearing period for humanity as a whole. Centuries of collective choices creating war, oppression, and spiritual blindness, reaching resolution through conscious forgiveness and spiritual understanding. This wouldn't be comfortable, but it would free humanity from repetitive cycles that had prevented spiritual evolution for millennia. The sleeping prophet understood that individual karma and collective karma are intimately connected. Personal healing contributes to species healing, while collective transformation creates supportive conditions for individual spiritual development. The intensive clearing he predicted for 2025 would offer unprecedented opportunities for both personal and planetary liberation from ancient patterns of unconsciousness. In one profound reading, Cayce described the scope of this clearing. The debts of ages will be balanced not through suffering but through understanding. Souls will recognize their participation in both creating and healing humanity's wounds, leading to compassion that transcends all judgment. This collective clearing would manifest through multiple processes occurring simultaneously: Historical injustices would surface for conscious acknowledgement and healing rather than continued resentment and division. Generational trauma patterns would be recognized and interrupted by souls choosing forgiveness over perpetual victimhood or guilt. Most significantly, humanity's relationship with power would undergo fundamental transformation. The use of authority to dominate rather than serve, the accumulation of wealth at others' expense, the perpetuation of systems that kept souls in spiritual ignorance. All of these patterns would come to light for collective healing through new choices based on love and service. Cayce predicted that souls would begin recognizing their individual participation in humanity's collective wounds. Those who had been victims in some lifetimes would remember being perpetrators in others. This recognition would dissolve the spiritual pride that kept healing incomplete and create genuine compassion for all souls caught in cycles of unconscious harm. The clearing would also address humanity's disconnection from the natural world and spiritual dimensions. Environmental destruction, the suppression of psychic abilities, the rejection of mystical wisdom in favor of purely material understanding. These collective choices would be consciously healed through new decisions that honored the sacred nature of all existence. The sleeping prophet emphasized that this clearing wouldn't require everyone to consciously remember their past life participation in creating humanity's wounds. Many souls would contribute to the healing simply by choosing love over fear, forgiveness over resentment, service over selfishness in their current life circumstances. The intensity of collective clearing might manifest as social upheaval, political transformation, economic restructuring, and cultural revolution. But Cayce urged souls to recognize these changes as healing processes rather than destructive forces, understanding that old systems based on unconsciousness must dissolve to make space for new ones based on spiritual wisdom. Your willingness to forgive those who have hurt you, to take responsibility for your own unconscious choices, and to serve the healing of humanity through your individual transformation contributes directly to the collective clearing Cayce saw as essential for our species' graduation into higher consciousness. If the intensity of these predicted changes feels overwhelming, Edgar Cayce offered profound reassurance. Souls incarnating in the late 20th and early 21st centuries came specifically equipped to navigate 2025's transformation and emerge empowered rather than defeated by its challenges. The sleeping prophet understood that cosmic intelligence doesn't create situations souls cannot handle. Every individual witnessing this pivotal time volunteered for the experience before incarnating, understanding both its difficulties and its unprecedented opportunities for accelerated spiritual development. In one particularly comforting reading, Cayce spoke directly to future generations. The souls who walk Earth during the Great Transition carry within themselves the very qualities humanity needs for successful transformation. They are not victims of chaotic times, but conscious participants in cosmic graduation. These souls possess several distinctive characteristics that prepare them for their sacred role. Heightened sensitivity that allows them to perceive spiritual truths others miss. Natural rebellion against authority structures that serve ego rather than spirit. Instinctive understanding of universal spiritual principles that transcend religious doctrine. Deep compassion for all beings caught in cycles of unconscious suffering. Most importantly, they carry what Cayce called remembrance seeds, dormant memories of their divine nature and spiritual purpose that would activate during the intensity of 2025's transformation. The very chaos and uncertainty that might overwhelm unprepared souls would serve as awakening catalysts for those who came to participate in humanity's graduation. the sleeping prophet predicted that children born in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s would demonstrate remarkable resilience and wisdom during this transition period. They would naturally understand that external changes, no matter how dramatic, cannot affect their essential spiritual nature. They would serve as bridges between the old consciousness passing away and the new consciousness being born. These souls would also demonstrate advanced psychic abilities that would help humanity navigate the dimensional shifts occurring during this time. Their telepathic sensitivity would facilitate new forms of communication. Their healing gifts would support others through the transformation process. Their natural spiritual authority would inspire trust in divine guidance rather than human institutions. Cayce emphasized that recognizing your role as a transitional soul brings both privilege and responsibility. You came to serve humanity's awakening, not to escape into personal spiritual bliss while others suffer. Your individual healing contributes to collective healing. Your choice to live consciously inspires others to awaken. Your commitment to love over fear helps create the new world being born. The future generations depends on souls like you fulfilling the sacred purpose that brought you to Earth during this pivotal time in human history. As 2025 unfolds exactly as Edgar Cayce predicted 8 decades ago, it becomes clear that what appears to be ending is actually beginning. The birth of a new phase of human consciousness that he described as the return to Eden, through wisdom rather than innocence. The sleeping prophet saw beyond the apparent chaos to the magnificent transformation occurring within it. Humanity was graduating from spiritual kindergarten into cosmic citizenship. Souls were remembering their divine nature after millennia of spiritual amnesia. Earth itself was ascending to higher vibrational frequencies that would support love-based consciousness as the natural human state. In one of his most beautiful visions, Cayce described what would emerge from 2025's intensive transformation. When the storms pass and the dust settles, humanity will find itself in a garden more beautiful than the original Eden. For this paradise will be created through conscious choice rather than innocent ignorance, through wisdom earned rather than gifts received, through love chosen rather than love unconscious. This new beginning wouldn't represent a return to some imagined golden past, but the birth of something unprecedented in human history, a civilization where spiritual wisdom guides material development, where individual growth serves collective evolution, where Earth's resources are stewarded with cosmic consciousness rather than exploited through unconscious greed. The advanced souls emerging from this transformation would possess capabilities that seem miraculous by current standards. Natural telepathic communication, healing abilities that restore balance through energy transmission, decision-making guided by direct divine inspiration, creative expression that channels universal beauty and truth. Most significantly, the distinction between spiritual and practical life would dissolve completely. Work would become service to the whole rather than personal survival strategy. Relationships would be vehicles for mutual spiritual development rather than emotional dependency. Education would awaken souls' innate wisdom rather than fill minds with information. Government would facilitate collective spiritual growth rather than maintain power structures based on control and domination. Cayce predicted that this transformation would accelerate rapidly once the critical mass of awakened souls was reached during 2025. What might otherwise take centuries would unfold in decades as conscious souls co-created new forms of human civilization based on love, wisdom, and service rather than fear, ignorance, and exploitation. The sleeping prophet emphasized that this new beginning wouldn't eliminate all challenges or suffering from human experience. Souls would continue learning and growing through both joy and difficulty, but the suffering would be conscious growth rather than unconscious repetition, chosen evolution rather than enforced experience, temporary purification rather than endless cycles of pain. You are witnessing and participating in the birth of this new world. Every choice you make for love over fear, consciousness over unconsciousness, service over selfishness, contributes to manifesting the magnificent future Cayce saw emerging from 2025's transformational crucible.